on Anansi's web of quiet wisdom. There was once a craftsman named Kojo who lived in a small village nestled between gentle hills and the sweeping curves of a slow river. He worked with his hands, carving bowls, weaving baskets, and shaping wooden toys for children he rarely saw smile. His shop was modest, just a dusty shelf, an old wooden table, and the steady beat of his hammer. Each morning, he opened his shutters before sunrise, not to greet customers, he had few, but to greet possibility. He believed in craftsmanship, in the quiet beauty of skill, but he did not yet believe in himself. One evening, as the air cooled and insects sang their last lullabies, Kojo sat at his loom, weaving a simple pattern. The colors were his own, dyed from roots and berries, earth-toned and honest. Then he felt it, a faint vibration in the air, like a chord tuned to stillness. He looked down, and frozen the loom sat a small spider, slender and calm, its legs moving as if pressing invisible threads into the weave. It paused, looked at him, and turned back to its work. Kojo's breath caught. He could not move. The spider's thread was not silk but light, not colored but feeling. And in that instant, he understood that he was no longer alone. The spider wove. Each day, at the same hour, it appeared. He dared not shoo it away. Instead, he learned to leave a small bowl of honey and a drop of water beside the loom. They were gifts. It did not speak. But after weeks, Kojo began to notice patterns. A loop here that carried patience, a knot there that taught restraint, a line that curved with humor. He couldn't explain it, but his hands knew. One morning, a merchant came by. He noticed a basket in the window. It glowed with extra care. He offered Kojo a price he'd never dreamt. But Kojo hesitated. His heart whispered that something more important than money had entered his shop. He said no. The merchant left confused. That night, the spider wove a new shape, a spiral that hummed with resilience. Kojo watched until the pattern closed. Then he whispered to the web, "Help me share." The web shimmered in response. Over the next days, Kojo began teaching not with words, but with woven pieces. He invited a child to weave a single thread. The child laughed when it tangled, but the web shimmered, and the child learned to untangle gently. A young woman came to learn patience. The web glowed when her hands slowed. The village elder showed up seeking humor. The web wove secret jokes in the pattern, and the elder smiled without knowing why. Quiet prosperity began to flow into the community. Not gold, not fame, but something deeper, a feeling of being seen, of learning together, of hands that did not tremble anymore at new skills. Kojo's shop became a place of small miracles. Travelers came, drawn not by advertising, but by stories: a silent loom, a spider's gift, a craftsman who taught without words. Soon, Kojo realized that the spider was no ordinary creature. It was Anansi the spider, who in ancient lore rescued wisdom for those who didn't need to hold it too tightly. Only Kojo didn't need to trade the web. He had found it at home, but the world needed it too. One morning, Anansi wove its final lesson into a web, a circle of threads connecting every knot Kojo had learned. It glowed so brightly, so quietly, that even the sun paused. Kojo stood and spoke softly, "Thank you." Anansi's thread unraveled into the air and drifted away. The spider left with it, and Kojo realized that he now carried the web within himself. He no longer needed Anansi weaving. Beside him, his hands remembered. The patterns remained, and the village remembered too. Kojo no longer expected the spider's return, but every morning he still left a drop of honey and a thread of silence near the loom. Not out of habit, but reverence. He understood now that the web had never belonged to the spider alone. It had always belonged to anyone willing to listen slowly, move carefully, and offer their hands without rush. With each sunrise, more villagers gathered not just to learn weaving, but to sit in the hush that surrounded the loom. It became a place where people spoke in fewer words and listened with more space between thoughts. There were no instructions, only demonstrations, and even those were quiet. Kojo began crafting what he called silent pieces, woven symbols that held stories within them. 1. Not for loss. 2. For growth. 3. For the kind of laughter that arrives after pain. A young mother came in one evening carrying grief like a hidden sack. Kojo handed her a woven square, light brown with threads of silver. She held it and wept not because of what was said, but because of what was understood without needing to be. Word of the loom spread beyond the village, not like fire, but like warmth. People from faraway towns came not looking for products, but for peace. Each visitor would bring something: a leaf, a feather, a strand of hair, a tiny stone. Kojo would gently place these into the fabric. Slowly, the loom became more than a tool. It became a witness. Every fiber carried pieces of dozens of lives. Yet, no piece shouted. All whispered, and that was enough. Children who once feared mistakes now embraced them. Kojo taught them to pause whenever the thread tangled. That knot, he'd say, with a smile that barely moved, is part of the pattern too. He taught a fisherman to see weaving in the way he cast his net. He taught a baker to understand patience in how dough rises. He taught a widow to recognize love in how her thread always curved toward others. The spider's presence faded into memory, but its wisdom deepened in the quiet. One day, the village square grew crowded, not because of any festival, but because people simply wanted to sit near the loom. Kojo didn't speak that day. He just wove a giant spiral, one thread, then another. People watched as the pattern expanded, then contracted into a perfect circle. And at the center of it all, he wove one single knot, made from a strand he had kept for years, the last thread Anansi had ever left. When it was done, the village elders stood and whispered, "This is not just a web, it is memory." The people nodded. The loom stood still, and then something strange happened. A soft breeze entered the room. The windows trembled. The threads glowed just faintly in. Those closest to the loom felt a shiver, not of cold, but recognition, as if something unseen had smiled. Kojo turned to the crowd and bowed not low, but deep enough to offer honor. Wisdom, he finally said aloud, after years of silence, was never meant to be hoarded, only held lightly so it can pass. He then gave the loom away. Piece by piece, he disassembled it and handed parts to different villagers: a leg to the young teacher, a beam to the baker, a spindle to the widow. "Build your own," he said, "and let it teach you." He walked away that evening with empty hands and a heart so full it almost glowed in his chest. As he left the village, someone whispered, Where is he going? But no one answered. They didn't need to. Kojo had taught them what Anansi had taught him. Sometimes, the thread that changes everything is invisible. Sometimes, the quietest patterns shape the loudest destinies. And sometimes, prosperity begins not in the marketplace, but in the hush, between two breaths, when a hand meets another, and both agree to weave without hurry, without fear, and without needing applause. The legacy of Anansi lived on not in legends or loud stories, but in every silent thread passed between hands that believe wisdom can still be made, one knot at a time.